this system is very good at co-opting and at violently repressing alternatives. And right now, we are literally about to extinguish humanity because of how violent this economic system is. So it's no longer compatible.
Welcome back to The Tea. I'm your host, Myriam François. Is this the final stages of capitalism? Today, over half of people globally believe that capitalism does more harm than good. And the younger you are, the less likely you are to see its benefits. And it's not exactly hard to see why. 15 years on from Occupy Wall Street and the rallying cry of "We are the 99%," frustration with the economic system has only deepened. Across much of the world, people are struggling with rising living costs, unaffordable housing, stagnant wages, debt, burnout, and growing insecurity, while corporations, banks, and defense companies continue posting record profits. According to Oxfam, the richest 1% now own more wealth than 95% of humanity. In the UK alone, 1 in 3 children now lives in poverty. Add growing fears around AI, with the World Economic Forum estimating that 92 million jobs could be displaced by 2030, and the collapsing trust in institutions, rising far-right movements across the world, climate collapse, and younger generations are increasingly questioning whether the system they inherited is actually working. Since the end of the Cold War, capitalism has become the dominant global economic system. Even countries still ruled by communist parties like China are deeply integrated into global markets. And while many feel frustrated with capitalism, it sometimes feels impossible to imagine an alternative system. So today we're asking, is another world even possible? And what will it take to usher it in? Well, joining me today is Clara Mattei, economist, political theorist, and a foundational voice for the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation. That's free to you and me. Her first book, The Capital Order, was named one of the best economics books of the year by the Financial Times and won the prestigious Herbert Baxter Adams Prize. Now she's back with a groundbreaking manifesto that Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis says restores hope that everything could be different. In her latest work, Escape from Capitalism, she argues that poverty, inequality, and are basically permanent crises that we see today, they're not bugs in the system. They're the system functioning exactly as designed. Clara Mattei, welcome to the show.
It's so lovely to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. So your work is informed by a really interesting personal backstory. And I was just wondering if you might be able to share a little bit about that and kind of how it feeds into the way that you see the world and the work that you do.
So I'm lucky enough to come from a family who resisted fascism concretely, putting their bodies on the line. So the book is kind of inspired by the courage of my great uncle, Gianfranco Mattei, who was a chemist. He was a professor of chemistry, very young, 26, and he was making the bombs against the fascist and Nazi occupation in Italy. The Nazis were, at a certain point, became our enemies while they were in Italy, and he was working with the partisans, the resistance, and he was caught. He was tortured for 3 days and then decided to actually commit suicide. He hung himself with his own shoelaces because he knew that he was going to not make it and not calling out his comrades. So he really did it out of a form of solidarity, not to rat people out. And he left a really intense note to his parents on the back of a check that he was able to give to his cellmate, and it reached the family, saying, be strong, knowing that I've been strong too. But, what's very sad is that my family members, like many other people still today who fight, they are fighting for a liberation. And of course, this liberation in Italy never really happened, because yes, you were liberated from fascism, but the institutional continuity, especially with economic policies, was really, really terrible, in the sense that the austerity that Mussolini was so good at enacting, austerity policies are the same ones that continued after his fall and continue today to shape our lives, producing all of the disasters that you were just describing.
So what is the connection between, I guess, austerity and fascism? And what is the resistance movement that you see yourself as part of a lineage of today? How is that resistance represented today?
First of all, it's really important to demystify the idea that fascism is somehow not capitalist. And this is really important because our history books tend to speak about fascism as something that is the corruption of the system that we want, right? And there's this big divide between fascism and liberalism that is really in our minds. We think of them as really worlds apart. If you focus on the economics of the two supposed opposite ideologies, you find out that they are very much in alliance when it comes to protecting what I call the capital order, namely wage labor and exploitation as the foundation of this economy. So in moments of existential threat to our economic system, and again, I really want to stress that history shows how the system is not permanent, is not universal, it's not natural. It has to be constantly protected. And there are moments in which people rise up more strongly than others. And after the First World War, this was one of the moments in which, in fact, there's so many alternatives that were being experimented with, even in the UK. In these moments, the elite react. They react very efficiently and they react very powerfully, and they do it with austerity. And why? Because austerity really works as it should. They tell us that austerity helps balance the budget and in a way like us live within our means and be virtuous economic agents. This is, of course, a lie. What austerity works for is what it should be doing, which is subordinating working people into accepting their position as workers that have lost agency in the workplace and also don't get to keep the value they produce, right? Which is actually what exploitation is about. And then again, it's not even about how much money you make. It's the fact that you literally don't get to hold on to what you've done. And most of the time you're working for a bottom line you don't believe in. We know many people who are doing pretty well working for Google or any of these big companies. They are supporting the genocide and the Israeli military. So everyone is trapped. Also, those who think of themselves as being supposed middle class, they are workers by definition because they're not in charge of their lives, basically, anymore. The point is that in moments of existential crisis that, again, exist and continue to exist, austerity operates very effectively to keep us disciplined. How? Well, by taking away our resources that allow us to live decently, right? So cuts in social expenditures is a very good case in point. Cuts in social expenditure is bad for us as people because, of course, we are increasingly dependent on the market, meaning that everything we need to buy, right? And if they cut education, if they cut healthcare, if they cut transport, we know we will need to purchase those goods. And this means that we will be even more willing to go work for whatever job to be able to get to the end of the month. If they privatize utilities, etc., what we're seeing today. In the meantime, the state shifts those resources in favor of the saving and investing elite, those who are indeed benefiting from the system, by de-risking, subsidizing, incentivizing private investment. And this is exactly what capitalism requires, is economic policies that actively intervene to make us more precarious while protecting and encasing those who benefit. So this has happened historically over and over. And no, austerity is not just about cuts in social expenditures. It's also about increases in taxes for labor while capital is structurally detaxed. So regressive taxation, again, it's not about the state stepping back. It's about the state actually shifting, diverting resources, those resources that we as workers create, by the way. Yes. The whole point is that all these policies are those that fascist governments were very good at doing. And Mussolini was adored by the liberal elites like Montagu Norman, the head of the Bank of England, The Times, The Economist magazine. They were all applauding because Mussolini was imposing the austerity measures that allowed to keep the workers at bay in a moment in which they were really revolting and presenting alternatives.
Okay, so we are going to get into austerity much more in a bit. But before I do, I want you to help our audience understand, because not everyone will be obviously an expert economist watching this. You describe yourself as an anti-capitalist political economist, and your work clearly draws from the Marxist tradition. What makes your approach to economics different from that of other economists?
From the mainstream, everything, I would say. Okay. So the book Escape from Capitalism is the result of me teaching for many years at the university and really helping students re-see the economy, really like put on a different lens. Like I usually like show them, like you put on your glasses, you put them down, you see the world differently. And this is what different economic theories do, right? They allow you to see the world differently and thus act differently and see problems that otherwise you wouldn't see. And unfortunately, maybe not many people know, but if you get stuck in a course in economics at the university, you will realize that unfortunately the way the discipline is taught is meant to blind you from the real problems. So economics is not a universal method. There's different traditions competing with one another. And the dominant one that is called mainstream or neoclassical is really dominant because it serves the system by blinding us from the real problems. I'll give you just one example. There's many. Markets are presented as the world of opportunity. So if you take a course in econ, they'll tell you, the market is the most efficient way to maximize consumers' preferences. This is exactly what they say. And this is a complete subversion of reality because the market is actually not the realm of opportunity and freedom. It's the realm of coercion. We have become under capitalism market dependent, meaning that we rely on the market for survival. And this means that we become instrumental to the market. And so you see already there is that if you focus on the market as the realm of opportunity, you miss out what is actually happening, which is that market rests on exploitation of workers that economists never talk about and never see. Because for an economist, they tell you value comes from the capacity to save and invest of the virtuous entrepreneur. This is actually the line, right? It's like the virtuous entrepreneur is the one we have to really think because they are those who produce value in society.
Because they're driving innovation.
They're driving innovation. They take the risk. They're the ones who hire the workers. So somehow it seems like that is the key to understand the supposed progress under capitalism. And you see how in this worldview, everything makes a lot of sense. Then we are in the best of all possible worlds because it's a very fair world in which everyone just gets what they put in, right? So in the models, you have the capitalist putting in capital, the worker putting in work, and everyone is getting according to their marginal productivity of their inputs. So this seems like a very fair deal.
So it all calibrates in the market, basically. We're told these markets operate freely. This is the free hand of Adam Smith that we taught, in my BA in economics, I bet we could just about remember. So this free hand is where there's a calibration between supply and demand. You would dispute that, is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I would say, that's a very abstract understanding. If like anyone who lives under capitalism understands that the market is not this harmonious world of competition in which everyone like maximizes their potential. It's the opposite. It's really about real competition and cutthroat war of everyone against everyone. Workers are pitted against each other, pitted against, of course, those who exploit them. And the capitalists themselves compete in a way that is very brutal. I took an Uber to get here and the driver just told me, Uber is worried about competition. They brought the price down. But what does bringing the price down mean? It means that it goes on the shoulders of the Uber drivers who now not only have to pay higher gasoline prices because of the imperialist wars abroad, but also they're bearing the cost of this increasing exploitation that is the way in which you win real competition in this market. So, the way we understand the market makes no sense because it's not reflected in reality. And this is the point about economics, what one studies at school, unfortunately, is that it's a way to really distort what would be instead an intuitive understanding you have by living in this economy. They brainwash you to the point that you see these things that never are. Because again, it's not about equality and justice. It's really about the subordination of those below us that are producing all the value, but exploitation is not in those models. So in this book, I'm building off of a tradition that is now not considered at school, unfortunately, which is the tradition of classical political economy, dating back to Adam Smith himself, who, in fact, you only remember the invisible hand because that's all they teach you. But Adam Smith actually saw the conflict between capital and labor and talked about it. And then Ricardo and Marx and many other theories after that.
So obviously we're speaking today on the backdrop of, what many think of as late stage capitalism. I don't know if that would be your assessment. Globally, around 56% of people say capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good. In the US, just 40% of under 30s today view capitalism positively. It's the first time in Pew's polling in history that younger Americans are viewing socialism almost as favorably, sometimes more favorably than capitalism. So why is capitalism in crisis? And why, in particular, are young people experiencing it as in crisis?
I believe that notwithstanding all of the doctrines that are there to make us accept the system, to make us passively consent to it, right now the economic violence is so obvious that those ideologies aren't working as they should in keeping us blind and accepting. And I think the younger generation is the one who is showing this, embodying this very, very clearly. The young generation, I think, is able to see what no public debate wants to even touch on, which is that there is a real clear contradiction between the logic of profit and the logic of need. Many supposed progressive economists take the wrong line by telling you that what we're seeing right now is a malfunctioning of capitalism, that the economy is not working, that the economy is not growing, that the problem is really that, there's some form of internal corruption, being excessive financialization, excessive monopoly power that is taking away competition. Those narratives that somehow tell you that the problem is not the system as such, it's some malfunctioning or corruption of the system, crony capitalism, whatever. This is something that I think young generations are realizing is already a problem in how we frame this, because the problem is not the malfunctioning of capitalism. The problem is that capitalism is delivering what it always was meant to deliver, namely capital accumulation that is heavily concentrated at the top. And the fact that now, like, the big three, BlackRock, Vanguard, and Easy Street, basically hold on to and are able to manage the majority of the wealth in the planet is not, a corruption of capitalism. It's the result of real competition that concentrates economic and political power. So I think right now, the young generation realizes that what we're seeing is the system working as it should. And genocide, militarism, high unemployment is what the system produces and needs to accumulate at even faster speeds. And of course, this goes against what is rational for us, which is care and sustainability. But that was never meant to be part of what capitalism took care of, right? Capitalism works upon an abstract logic that couldn't care less about nature and especially about humanity.
So is that what makes your argument distinct? Because I think obviously there are quite a lot of voices today who argue that, there's a serious problem with the economic system. Thomas Piketty, obviously, he argues that capitalism naturally concentrates wealth because people who own assets like property and stock see their wealth grow faster than people who rely on wages. Grace Blakely, whom we've had on the show, argues that modern capitalism is increasingly driven by kind of close alliances between governments, big corporations, and the financial sector. I mean, what's distinct about your argument, specifically the idea that the system itself is the problem as opposed to bugs in the system?
Absolutely. We need a systemic analysis that is able to give us the big picture, and then we can focus on the specifics. And the big picture is that this is capitalism working as it should. And this is, in fact, different from a lot of the Marxian thinkers that try to instead suggest that the problem, is this divide between the real and the financial economy. This distinction is purely false. It's not like the problem is finance and the real industry is like so virtuous and good for us. No, the two have always gone together. What we see is just the acceleration of what always was, which is a system that from the very beginnings, the origins of capitalism, the UK is the cradle of the system, was all based on the violent appropriation of common resources, right? So what we call the enclosure of the commons was a form of austerity, because again, austerity is in the DNA of the system because there's nothing spontaneous to it. There's always states, governments intervening to make it happen. And how did it happen at the beginning? Well, the parliament, the bourgeois parliament, decided to approve laws that allowed for the privatizations of those spaces, those lands, those resources that were allowing people to survive independently from the market. And once you privatize our means of survival, then of course you have a lot of people who are willing to come and, work for the Industrial Revolution. Well, guess what? There wouldn't have been that Industrial Revolution if you hadn't really uprooted people from their lands.
Well, speaking of land, we're currently living in what activists and researchers called global land grab. As of 2026, roughly 100 families now own approximately 42 million acres of land in the United States. More and more of the world's land is being owned by a very small number of corporations, billionaires, and institutions. Bill Gates is the largest owner of farmland in the US, with around 275,000 acres across almost 20 states. And in the UK, Danish billionaire Anders Holversen, who many of us will never have heard of, owns more than 220,000 acres in Scotland, while, of course, the Crown estate controls about 615,000. So why are all of these billionaires and millionaires buying up land?
The underlying principles never changed. Land is the most important means of survival for humanity that has been made into a commodity. And this means that it has been separated from the logic of need and instrumentalized to foster the logic of profit. And right now we know that, of course, with the ecological catastrophe, land is even more precious. And, agribusiness is one of the most successful sectors. But, this is very clear example in Brazil, one of the countries in which there's the biggest amount of starving children. And, this world does not feed us, right? We know that there's over 2 billion people on the planet who are food insecure. And the numbers, even the World Bank has to admit, if you look at the current data, that the numbers of malnutrition and food insecurity have gone up, right? And of course, especially because of what we're doing all over the Middle East and also Africa that we always forget about. And so while capitalism is not meant to feed us, it can really thrive off of food business. And in Brazil, they are the biggest exporters of food all around the world while their own population is actually starving. So you see the land becomes a space where the workers suffer to produce food that is then going to be exported abroad. And the global south sees this every day. And not by accident, every hour there's $30 million that are being extracted from the global south to the rich of the global north. So, the trajectory every hour. And this is Oxfam data. So the whole story that we are the good people bringing humanitarian aid, no, I'm sorry. They are aiding us because we are extracting everything they have. And land is, of course, part of it.
Right. And this is the argument made in the book, The Underdevelopment of Africa, right? Which is based on, I think, very much this idea that Africa is subsidizing our lifestyles. So let me just come back to this idea that evidence that inequality and exploitation are sort of systemic features of capitalism as opposed to state capture by elites. Because, of course, many of your colleagues would disagree with that analysis, right? So economists like the Nobel Prize winners, Darren Acemoglu, apologize for the pronunciation, James Robinson, they argue that the real problem is not markets themselves, but what they call extractive institutions, systems where political and economic power get concentrated in the hands of a few. So they basically say that markets can generate broad prosperity when institutions are democratic and inclusive. So the real danger is elite capture. So is the problem elite capture?
Oh my goodness, I don't know even where to start. This is a great example of how pernicious supposed progressive ideas can be in blinding us even further. And, I had the occasion of meeting Robinson on the Jon Stewart show, which was quite an experience because it's difficult to imagine how convinced these people of outmost lies that are really, really detrimental to any social transformation. So you see here, the idea is that for them, the market is the realm of democracy and freedom and opportunity. And then there's something from outside that is encroaching. And you see, these supposed progressive economists, they distinguish themselves from the mainstream neoclassicals by saying, look, we're not idealizing the markets. We are saying that there's nothing pure in the markets, that there is some institutional intervention. But then at this point, they do this to then put the blame on the institutions rather than the market itself. So they pretend they're distinguishing themselves from the neoclassicals, but they're not, because the underlying assumption is that markets and democracy go hand in hand. And what I want to stress is that the reason why, I'm not denying there's corrupt institutions, and it is the case that in the global south, like in the global north, there are corrupt institutions. But you can't reduce it, as Robinson literally said on the show, the Colombians are poor because their governments are corrupt. This is the way you see, you're again putting the blame on the victims, A, and B, not realizing that the reason why corruption exists is because our governments are catered for and to an economy that is profoundly anti-democratic and based on systemic corruption, like my colleague Camila Vergara speaks about. She's an amazing political theorist and shows that, there are constitutions. There is the political element that allows for the supposed market to operate as they do in this exploitative oligarchic way. So you see, the point is that the markets themselves are anti-democratic because they're based on exploitation, and thus they produce corrupt institutions that are the ones that keep protecting those very elites that benefit from this exploitation. So their analysis should be just turned upside down, right? And instead what they do is they try to create this false divide so that they can blame, A, the workers themselves and, the people living in the global south. And by the way, 7 out of 8 people live in the global south. So basically you're trying again to somehow propose that these people will catch up to the great progressive institutions of the global north, because that's another insane story economists tell you, is that, yes, they are underdeveloped, but they will catch up if they adopt the most efficient institutions, if they open up to the markets, if they, liberalize. That's a lie. The reality is that we are rich because they are poor. And so our development creates their underdevelopment, and the corrupt institutions are the product of this fundamental economic inequality that goes deep, deep into the system.
Well, on that note, because that is the dominant view, right, that progress will follow if, they follow certain economic models. The most common defense of capitalism that I'm sure you're familiar with is that despite all its brutality, which is often acknowledged, it's somehow lifted hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty, especially in Asia. So according to the World Bank, extreme poverty fell from around 2.3 billion in 1990 to 831 million in 2025. Our World in Data also says the last 3 decades saw faster progress against extreme poverty than ever before. So how do you respond to people who say, yep, capitalism, unequal, violent, but no other system has delivered that scale of material improvement globally? Something's been happening to this show that I want to be honest with you about. It's hard to believe this has to be said in 2026, but demonetization and shadow bans have been hitting us regularly, sometimes weekly, and every single time the conversations we work so hard to bring you become harder to sustain. Every episode takes real work. The guests we speak to, the researchers who dig beneath the surface, the producers who make sure what you're watching actually meets the standards it should. None of that happens for free. And right now, this is not sustainable. Most people scrolling their feeds right now will never find this conversation. And that's not an accident. That's by design. And that's why we've decided to build something of our own, the T Network. At the tnetwork.co, we're creating a space where these conversations can thrive without being dependent on algorithms. When you join, every episode is delivered directly to your inbox, completely ad-free. You'll also receive our weekly newsletter with my personal take, deeper analysis that goes beyond the interviews, bonus content, early access, and exclusive deep dives into the stories that matter most. Plus, there's more coming. Most importantly, you'll be helping to make this work possible. You'll be supporting independent journalism, fearless conversations, and the voices and stories that too often go unheard. Independent journalism can only survive when people choose to support it. If these conversations have informed you, challenged you, or helped you make sense of the world, I'd love for you to join us. You'll find the link at the top of the description, or you can head directly to the tnetwork.co.
First of all, because the metrics that we use to qualify and read reality are metrics that serve the function of justifying our economic system, right? And GDP or GMP is a clear example, because what these economists do is actually measure per capita income. And per capita income, by the way, never tells you about the distribution. It just is an addition of the value of goods and services, you see? And this is already a very abstract measure that really only qualifies like well-being in terms of basically prices, right? So it's reducing our qualification of our existence to those categories that help the system shine for what, of course, the system does. It does produce a lot of value, but this is an abstraction, as Marx told us from the beginning. Like, the fact that our society focuses on value production is exactly what he defined fetishism. And it's interesting because Marx was using fetishism exactly to tell the West, hey, you guys, you think you're so much more civilized than those population in Africa who, adore a totem and they fetishize this totem. But you don't understand that your level of fetishism is much more pernicious and universal, because now it's no longer the totem that you fetishize, but it's a system that you produced and that now dominates you, right? So the totem was dominating these societies because the totem was seen as an external force that objectively and universally dominated. But now nothing has changed. This external force has become value production that is, by the way, the product of our social relations, but we stop seeing it as the product of our social relation and we fetishize it as some objective truth that then, of course, commands us. And the categories we use, like GDP production, is a clear example. It's just like, if you see economic history books, they say, well, look, the world was crap until we started actually producing value, and look, now there's a straight line going up. And this is, I think, really what we need to debunk, because also you need to go look at how they even measure poverty in itself. Like, even if we do want to use money as the metrics, which I think is very problematic, because, many societies live without monetary transaction because they are connected to what they need to reproduce themselves. Again, you see, you can't measure the well-being of this person if you're just focused on monetary measurement, right? So that's how you can say you're uplifted. No, you're not uplifted. The World Bank itself actually showed that poverty has increased in the last couple of years. They had to admit this. And I think the point is that we need to look at the overall living experiences of people that are just constantly detached from their livelihoods to try to survive by being employed in huge corporations that come in and actually exploit their material conditions.
But isn't China a sort of indication of that success in many ways? So people would say that it's obviously accounted for a huge share of the global poverty reduction since the 1980s. That happened after China opened its economy, expanded manufacturing and exports, integrated into global trade, while still keeping, of course, a strong state control over key industries. So economists like Danny Roderick argue that China succeeded through this hybrid model, not through kind of classical Maoism alone. It looks to many people like this is one of the biggest poverty reduction stories in modern history, which relied on markets, industrialization, and participation in capitalism.
I think when people talk about poverty reduction, and again, you point the finger exactly on the point. Like, the reason why globally we can say that maybe poverty numbers have gone down, not immediately, but in the past, is because of China's war on poverty. But I would really like to stress that war on poverty is a form of post-capitalism, in the sense that what capitalism is about mediating all our needs through private investors' profits. Okay, so anything we want, from what we're wearing to the chairs, happens because capitalists decide to invest because they see an expectation for profit. Okay, and so this is the whole point, is that we're mediating our needs through private investors' profits and market relations. That's not what China did with the eradication of poverty, right? There was a plan. The plan was not mediated. The idea is that we have an objective that is a political objective, And this takes priority over any economic criteria, right? So this is the opposite of what happens in the West, because in the West, what happens is that anything that is not compatible with the logic of profit is considered utopian, right? So, yes, it would be good to have better social housing, but our debt doesn't allow us to do it, or there's like some economic constraint. But this is the whole point about planning that has been done in this case for China, is like the planning is actually the idea that you are putting political projects that are affirming themselves beyond the logic of profit and in priority to the logic of profit. And there's a big discussion about, is China capitalist, is it not? I would say China is not capitalist, has not, of course, overcome wage labor, which is a very important point to make a society fully democratic, because I believe that in the future we should overcome wage labor, which is really where the anti-democratic pressures come in. But in a way, they are able to assert political priority over private investors in a way that relies on planning and control, which is something that we've never experienced in the West ever.
But didn't they also put kind of the plan above the value of human life, right? There are millions of people who've been killed as part of the sort of plan, or allowed to die, whichever way you want to see it, because certain political priorities were placed ahead of the daily realities of farmers or people in agricultural areas. Is that not also the case?
Yeah, I'm not trying to idealize any reality. Absolutely. That is definitely the case. So without idealizing, but at the same time also without demonizing, because this is what happens. It's like, oh, look, they killed all these peasants. Like, yeah, what are you doing? You're like, literally go to the US, people are dying in the streets. Like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I live, people are literally dying in the street. And yeah, like, is that different? I don't think so. I do think that the eradication of poverty is a very good example of what, like, beating the logic that is constraining us with political priorities, that it is a possibility and it is feasible. It's just like we need to get out of our Western traps.
So let me ask you about this statement by former World Bank economist Branko Milanovic. He argued in 2019 that capitalism has essentially become the dominant global system because it outperformed rival models in generating growth, in raising living standards at scale. I'm sure you're very familiar with this argument. Since the 1980s, even countries that were once associated with socialism or even communism, from China to Vietnam to the kind of post-Soviet states like Russia, they've all embraced markets, private enterprise, global trade. So if capitalism is so obviously failing, why have so many countries, including formerly socialist ones or communist ones, move towards the capitalist model?
Well, because this economic system is extremely good at asserting itself in very violent ways. And so rather than having an explanation that is kind of internalistic and self-congratulatory, if you study the period of the Cold War, you realize that it was a war exactly because there was a constant need to repress alternatives. And, the alternatives were sprouting, the so-called third world alternatives, all of the coups that the United States, as the leading capitalist country, supported actively in Latin America and around the global South. This cannot be outside of this picture. It's a war of all against all, and it's protected and maintained alive by government intervention that is very violent, as we're seeing today. I mean, not by accident that our bills are going up, because there's like an imperialist war abroad that is expanding and killing thousands and thousands of people and starving hundreds of thousands. It's awful. What I think is really important is really to find out that this system is very good at co-opting and at violently repressing alternatives. And this needs to be part of how we explain the history, our past. And right now, you can say, sure, we've won so far, but look around us. Like, we are literally about to extinguish humanity because of how violent this economic system is. So it's no longer compatible. So I think a lot of this rhetoric also needs to be like, okay, but let's look at today. Like, the world is on fire, both because of the ecological catastrophe that the system produces and the escalating militarism that the system needs. Militarism and capitalism are indistinguishable. You cannot have capitalism without austerity and militarism. And we've seen it in the history of this system all the time. On the free podcast, I interviewed a wonderful Lebanese scholar who's also a dear friend, and she works on ecologies of resistance in South Lebanon. And, that is an area, she told me, like, after 1945, it's not like the World War II stopped. It was just externalized in the global South. I mean, if you live in Lebanon, especially South Lebanon, you've seen war all your life. Like, for you, that is the norm. It's just like, and that's how the value we produced is dumped so that we can produce more of it, right? Because otherwise you create overproduction problems. And so you need to use the bombs once you produce them. And there's always a space to use those bombs.
So I really want to talk about the connection between imperialism, capitalism, wars in just a sec. But before I do, let me ask you about the countries that are often cited as sort of the good examples of kind of ethical capitalism. So countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, even post-war Germany, I guess, capitalist economies, but they produce far lower inequality, stronger labor protections, higher social mobility, broader prosperity, I guess, in places like the US. Norway, for example, is one of the richest countries in the world, and it consistently ranks among the lowest in inequality. And around 82% of people own their own homes or are part of cooperatives. Isn't this evidence that capitalism can produce socially healthy societies with low inequality?
So it's funny because, again, thank you so much, because these are all like the key points that keep us kind of like, okay, stuff are bad, but we're still the best around. And
that's exactly why we wanted to ask you, because
exactly.
I think that a lot of this conversation gets stopped at these hurdles every single time.
And every single one of them is based on such a bad and superficial, like, historical research. I was inviting in Sweden. The first translation of the book, The Capital Order, was in Swedish. And guess why? Because if you go to their country, they tell you, well, we are experiencing hardcore austerity. They are privatizing. The state is subsidizing. Even in Sweden, the big thing is that the state heavily subsidizes private schools, like in the US, and is constantly cutting public schools. What austerity is, like, you shift resources from the many to the few. And again, this works for the logic of profit that is based on these two pillars, wage labor and private command over investment. So what's happening in Sweden is absolutely the same as is happening here, just with like Swedish qualifications, but they are the reason why the far right is rising also there is that people have been impoverished largely by cuts in social expenditures, interest rates hikes, privatization. So unfortunately, that narrative is false. I'm writing a book exactly to debunk the golden age myth, because that's part of the myth. Is like, oh, there's the Scandinavian countries that somehow are humane capitalism, and you go there and you ask people living there, like, no, we have been under attack with austerity for the majority of the time we remember, and it's getting worse and worse there too. So same stuff. And they're, by the way, also rearming. So the same stuff, like, it's exactly the same template.
So let's talk about austerity a little bit, because we are basically headed into an economic recession. We keep being told, prepare for, brace for impact, basically. Food prices, we're being told, are going to surge by like 50% in the next year or so here in the UK. We've just lived through massive inflation. Post-COVID, we were told we had borrowed too much and we have to now impose austerity to balance the books. So the story, as I understand it, as a mere citizen of this country, is that when we borrow too much, let's say to pay people when they have to stay at home or for whatever other reason, we then have to tighten our belts, is how we're told it is, right? And so we have to restrict expenditure, because otherwise we're going to end up in more debt. And if we end up in more debt, then we end up just servicing our debt. And when we just service our debt, our currency becomes devalued. And that is bad for our standing and for the value of the pound, and it impacts everyone negatively. So that's what we're told, and I think most people semi-accept as the why of austerity. But you say that austerity isn't about economics, that it's just about politics. So how would you respond to people who say, well, if we don't, quote unquote, tighten our belt, we are going to weaken our currency and devalue and see, huge inflation. And that's not good for people either.
I would tell these people that they are right. The only problem is that they don't need to fall in the idea that this is the only possible solution. A lot of progressive economists, I think, fool us in giving us a sense that under capitalism, anything goes. That you can have, a huge welfare state, that you can have very happy workers and still be under capitalism. I think this is a profound lie, because what you see if you study history is that there are very big political limits to how much social redistribution is possible under capitalism. And this is very clear. Because if people had enough to live decently without going to work for a crappy job, they wouldn't accept exploitation, and we would be thinking about other ways to organize work and the production of our goods. So this is very clear when you talk about unemployment, is that this system is not compatible with full employment. And this is something that you don't need a Marxian economist to tell you. It's enough to look at the macro models of mainstream economists. They know that if unemployment is too low, and this is the models that all central banks use, when unemployment is too low, the political conditions for capitalism fall. Why? Because the bargaining power of workers goes up, because there's no one taking their place behind them if they decide to quit. And this produces a subversion of the class oppression that is at the foundation of this economy. So this is really important, is that everyone knows that you need a good degree of unemployment to make the economy stable. So unemployment is the product of this economy, but it's also the solution, because if there weren't unemployment, people would not be accepting the social foundations of this economy. So going back to your point, you see that under capitalism, there are serious political constraints. And the constraint is you need to keep workers on edge so that they're willing to work. And so this means that dismantling social resources serves as exactly that purpose. So when people say, we need to protect our currency, yes, the way under capitalism you protect the currency is to have workers sacrifice. This is, again, it's a truth that if you don't keep workers weak, you might have a very big problem in having low prices to export, right? Because the whole point here is that you need to keep low prices in order to win real competition. And low prices come by lowering the cost of production, right? And either you increase productivity or you repress wages. You need to do it one or the other ways. And the way that you're going to be able to get people to accept this is if you keep them on edge, knowing that they're substitutable. So what I want to stress here is that austerity is not a political choice. It's a political requirement under capitalism if you want to support capitalism. The point here is that we don't need to accept capitalism as the only solution. So I would tell this person, yes, you're right. We shouldn't fool ourselves. If we are under capitalism, there are certain economic constraints. And it is the case that, if governments decide to tax wealth, they will incur in serious capital strikes, Strikes, it's not just workers who strike. The worst for capitalism is when capital strikes, meaning that, it leaves the country, investors stop investing.
Google heads to Dublin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if investors stop investing, capitalism is screwed because we depend on private investment and we do depend on private capital. So this will be the consequence of better conditions for workers, of wealth taxes. But the point here is not to say, then we don't do it because we need to maintain status quo. The point is we do it and then we face the consequences and understand how we can get out of this trap and build a better system.
So I really want to talk about the escaping the system part in just a second. But before we do, let's really talk about the ways in which we're now seeing the kind of global crisis of capitalism we've discussed kind of happening concurrently to a global rise in fascism, right? So the far right in power in Israel that's been, behind the genocide across Europe, in your home country, Italy, my country of origin, France, where, it looks like that's where we're headed as well. The reform elections here in this country. So is it a coincidence that the crisis of global capitalism is occurring alongside the rise of the far right? And what lessons can we learn from the Palestinian case that teach us about maybe where we're all headed? Just a quick reminder, if you haven't already, please do join us over at the T Network. The kind of conversations we have on this show don't always sit comfortably with algorithms. We get shadow banned, restricted, and there's always a risk that a platform could pull the plug entirely. That's not abstract, that's the reality we operate in every single day. Joining the T Network is how you step outside that system. Every episode comes straight to your inbox, no algorithm, no platform deciding whether you see it. Ad-free with exclusive analysis, bonus content, and my weekly newsletter. But here's what really matters. Every person who joins is part of why we can keep doing this. You're not just supporting a show, you're protecting the space where these conversations happen. It takes less than a minute. The link is in the description or go to thetnetwork.co.
I would definitely say that the rise of the far right is exactly the product of the success of austerity. And in this sense, again, when keeping in mind that austerity does not balance the budget, but does, in fact, maintain the class balance that is necessary for the system. So what we see today is just an acceleration of austerity working as it should to weaken us, to convince us there's no alternatives, because austerity is both policies, what I call the trinity of fiscal, monetary, industrial austerity, but also all the ideas that justify it, right? And that make us think that the problems, of course, are the poor, are the migrants, it individualizes us. Again, it points the finger in the wrong direction. So what we see today is the fact that with these ideas circulating and the hardship that everyone is feeling because of how austerity operated, of course, the consensus goes towards a supposed false alternative. It needs to be kept in mind that Israel itself is one of the most unequal countries in the world. And there is a lot of suffering within the workers in Israel too. And the best thing is to divert that anger that should be directed towards the system and towards the actual capitalist economy that is working as it should to exploit you and make you even more miserable, instead of diverting that anger towards where it should, which is the systemic, okay, let's get out of this. You divert it towards those that you then kill like flies. And what Farage is saying here in this country is terrifying. But people want to hear these terrifying, like he's literally saying that it's absolutely fine to basically get rid of these migrants physically. What we're doing, by the way, because in the last 10 years, over 32,000 people died in the Mediterranean seas. And not counting all the people that are dying even in the desert to arrive to Libya, whether they're tortured. And this is all financed by our money, like our tax money is actually going to finance the torture camps in Libya to not to protect us from the migrants. So yeah, Palestine is like a microcosm, a lens that tells us how far the destruction also in our own countries can go when austerity in fact dominates as the solution for capitalism, and we end up destroying everyone around us and ourselves.
And in your book, you talk about the ways in which austerity was basically applied by the Israelis to the Palestinians' economy, right? So they essentially, after Oslo, there was some kind of promises of a kind of semi-independent economic situation within the Palestinian territories that were going to be led by the Palestinian Authority. But essentially what ended up happening was that economy ended up being subverted in service to the Israeli economy. And so there's a sort of almost like a system of, wage slavery that occurs. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works? And to what extent is that a sort of extreme version of what we're also experiencing?
This is exactly the point, is to de-exceptionalize Palestine. Again, Palestine, quote unquote, the Palestinian territories. By looking at the economic dimension. And again, I don't want to reduce it all to an economic dimension because we know it's highly complex, but it is very important to note that all of the conflicts that our mainstream media focuses on, that are usually like cultural or religious, actually have a very deep root and economic violence. And this is very clear. The Ottoman Empire that fell after the First World War, and then we had the mandate, the colonization of Britain in the region, right? Britain came and with the French, basically, they divided the area very artificially, like literally drawing borders that were never there. Part of what they did was accelerate privatization and the expulsion of people from their land. So in a space that was actually really syncretistic in terms of all religions getting together, and when you tell our Lebanese and Palestinian friends about anti-Semitism, they look at you like you're crazy because they're all Semitic. Like they're literally all Semitic. Anti-Semitism is just like a construction of the West that then we impose on those cultures that we're all together syncretically. And this togetherness was also like a very different economy that was connected with the land organically, ecologically, and was very self-sufficient. The majority of Palestinian population was actually living off of their own means of production. And this is what happens after 1917 is that there is an acceleration of the proletarianization process in which you enforce market dependence. And you do it through state and imperial institutions that come in, disrupt the indigenous values and economic practices and impose the capitalist logic. And unfortunately, Palestine saw that like really, really deeply, of course, connected with the Zionist movement, in which you started privileging Jewish corporations that then took over land, resources, water, so not even in Gaza, and everything they need is owned by Israeli corporations. And so they had literally nothing. And even when they do want to go work for an Israeli company, they are rendered superfluous, not only the checkpoints and like the disasters to even like get to their jobs, but it's also that they are constantly being substituted. So now we're at that point in which, Palestinian labor is ultimately superfluous labor because there was policies to get other migrant labor coming in from the region. So then you can exterminate Palestinians without even suffering too much economically because you have another pool of what Marx called the latent reserve army ready to get hired. And again, pitting the poor against the poor. So what we see there, and of course all the fiscal austerity, the way the taxes were actually used to take away resources, and this is so obviously political. The Israel basically controls all the commercial taxes that should go to the Palestinian government, quote unquote, and doesn't give it back. And so this means that the public workers, like school teachers, even like taking away the genocide, the proper, in peacetime, even the proper functioning of, the education system, the hospitals, these public employees don't get money because the money is being captured by the Israeli authorities. So the story is much deeper. And of course, it goes further back than October 23rd, 2023, which seems like the starting point of any like contemporary analysis. No, let's bring it back to the 100 years ago and the imperialist intervention to create what is the norm under this global economy.
So let me now talk a little bit about the resistance to this system, which of course is what the whole book is about, this escape from capitalism. One of the key questions I have is around this idea, which is obviously central to Marxist analysis, about worker power, right? And, the idea that if we unionize and if workers get together, that they can push back against, the greedy corpse, as it were. But we're also hearing that a huge proportion of the workforce is now going to be replaced by AI. So if this future does emerge, where many of the workforce are replaced and then put on things like, universal basic income, UBI, where does the power of the workforce come from?
This is an acceleration of these processes. Unemployment is endogenous. It comes from within this system. It's not the system not working. It's the system producing that unemployment that comes from the technological innovation that we seem to think it's a good word, but technology is not being deployed to make our life more comfortable, right? So we see the results, but of course could also be a more comfortable life, fridges, televisions, I'm not denying. But the point is that result is the product of this war of competition that requires technological innovation to beat the competitors. And this is very clear with, of course, with AI, is that, this is the frontier of real competition. And given that there is no plan and it's complete anarchy in which all the businesses that can be in this field are competing with one another, we have no control. Like, it's complete loss of control. There's no political control over these processes. What we can predict is that it's going to have an insane impact on increasing unemployment. And then at that point, the question is, what happens? Because, the technocratic story that the machines will work for us and we will do well is great, but not under capitalism. I mean, it can be a scenario, but it would not be under capitalism, namely because capitalism is based on unpaid labor of people, because that's the source of profit. So then we would really be in a post-capitalist scenario. Now, is this going to be democratic or authoritarian is something that we need to actively work to see where it can go.
Final question to you about this escape from capitalism. So we're obviously speaking 15 years on from the Occupy Wall Street, which sparked huge public anger and energy, but ultimately many people would say didn't really translate to much. Where is the hope for this escape going to come from? And how do you even begin to imagine that future when so many people have a stake in the existing system?
I'm convinced that we just need new categories. We can't go back to this idea of like betting it all on the unions. By the way, unions, did their struggles, but were part and parcel of the system by which like their main focus was just economic, increasing wages, just doing good for like one very specific categories of workers that were always elite with respect to other workers that were, of course, right now the gig economy and the precarization is worse, but they're always, weaker workers, right? From the global south, women, just unskilled labor that was not unionized. So unions in a way do produce this segmentation and hierarchies amongst workers that I don't think is an ideal world, right? The ideal world is to try to really call out for economic democracy. And this is really important. I think all the words like communism, socialism, these words, I don't think they're useful at all in this historical moment. They're attached to baggages, to misconceptions, to, realities of oppression. We need to leave that behind and use words that can attract and bring people together instead of dividing people. And that's why the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation that we founded in Tulsa is called FREE, because we need to say, well, freedom is only compatible with a post-capitalist society that we need to actively build. So I do not have a template for this, and no one should, because that's a very abstract mindset that is part of or what I hope is the old world, right? The technocrats that have like this very abstract recipe that they try to impose that doesn't lead anywhere. Democracy is about building alternatives together. With the FREE, we have a public education platform that is super important, because I think the first thing is also what you do here is emancipatory knowledge. So the first way is to get people to think outside the box. And this knowledge shouldn't just be left to those privileged that can study. It needs to be diffused. We need to re-educate ourselves of being collective political animals. It's only like proving that collectively we can make decisions that are effective, that we can say, well, we can do better than what we have now. So in my mind, the FREE is one experience out of many. They exist. They're never publicized. There's a lot of experiments out there of post-capitalist alternatives that are actually ecological and democratic. And it's about building them where you are. And, with the FREE, we can offer this global template that we have a couple of assemblies that are now sprouting, but these assemblies are really the beginning of this dual power structure. Like, the way to confront the system is to put pressure on our institutions and our representatives. And you can put pressure only if you're organized. For example, in Tulsa, we did launch a campaign on participatory budgeting that is a very good recipe, anti-austerity, to say, actually, our taxes, we decide where that money goes, and it's not going to go like to funding the corporations and the genocide. It goes to our services. The mayor in Tulsa now has been receptive incredibly and is like seeming to be interested in doing these projects. So one thing is to pressure the current institutions, and that is very important. You can only do that if you're organized and connected with your citizens and your inhabitants around you. And the other is also to try to use these assemblies as a space to build alternative to market dependence. Like, how do we breach market dependence? Well, we take on, production of our basic needs. In Tulsa, 1 out of 4 children is hungry in Oklahoma. And by the way, I think the statistics in the UK are not that much better.
3
right? Live in poverty, exactly. So many kids are hungry here too. So taking back also food production is already very revolutionary. Like, how can we actually feed and house people? And I think this is something that the community can do, and it can build and then show, hey, we don't need you. We can do it ourselves. So it's I think, dual strategy. Knowledge goes with creating alternative solidarity economies, and of course, pressuring the current institutions to do more. Because if you go for an anti-austerity platform, and if it's being implemented, this will necessarily mean breaking from the system. Austerity does produce economic disequilibrium, but it produces social possibility of breaking away from the logic of profit. So there's a variety of strategies that I think we need to put in place. We need to learn from past experiences, but use words that resonate with people. And that is really important, because enough. The left is super guilty of being stuck in these elitist cliques. No one cares. People want to hear actual emancipatory language and practice. So if you're interested in joining the free, we have a website, we have assemblies growing around the world, and I hope we can all work for a better future also with you.
Clara Mattei, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you like what we do here, don't forget to join us at thetnetwork.co for ad-free episodes and exclusive content. Please like and subscribe here on YouTube and follow us on Instagram and TikTok for updates. Stay curious, stay awake, and we'll see you soon for more tea.